One of the earliest empirical analyses of mountains and war comes from Fearon and Leighton in 1999, who were looking specifically at rough terrain and ethnic violence. They made the case that minorities are more likely to experience war if they live in rough terrain, hills and mountains in particular. To make this case, they've made a lot of assumptions. One is that they haven't subjected it to a formal analysis. They've performed an interocular test of the data. They've eyeballed the data set. They look at the data, but they don't analyse them formally. Nevertheless, in eyeballing these data, they were struck by how many of the minorities were reputed as being mountain peoples, such as the Kurds, the Chittagong hill tribes of Bangladesh, the Vietnamese Montagnards, and mountain groups in Myanmar and northeast India. Now, to me, one of the most interesting things about doing research is to read the footnotes. When we read footnotes, we often find where the bodies are buried, the methodological shortcomings that the authors haven't quite answered but have put in a footnote just to keep one of the reviewers happy. Fearon and Leighton are no exception. In a footnote, they state, there could be other factors involved here. Some would argue that what matters is the typical culture of hill people, warlike and resistant to state authority, rather than the better prospects for rebellion that rough terrain gives them. Given that examples of the relationship appear in cultures as diverse as Vietnamese Montagnards, Kurds and Basques, the common cultural feature would have to be related somehow to the structural feature of terrain. For instance, perhaps hills tend to poverty, and thus little incentive for lowland states to extend their rule, and thus relative inexperience with state authority, thus resistance as states finally extend their grasp to the hills. So, 3 important points are to be found in that footnote. First, hill or mountain people are warlike. Second, hill or mountain land is poor. Third, people in hills have little exposure to the mechanism of the state, so they resist the state. They are independent. These 3 ideas have been at the foundations of writings on mountain peoples from the Greeks to the present day. So to demonstrate that, let's go back to Strabo. For Strabo, mountains made for a wretched existence, which could be made better by good governance. Strabo tells us that the Greeks inhabiting mountainous areas were able to live happily because they had the sense to develop good government. Similarly, the Romans in occupying savage regions taught the natives how to live with government. He takes this a step further. Mountains make warriors, but flat lands make peace. Indeed, warriors in the mountains and peaceful people in the flatlands could complement each other. Europe has done well as the continent has mountains throughout, meaning that both groups live side by side. But as the people in the flatlands are more numerous, they will keep a check on those warlike mountain people. But all of Europe that is level and has a temperate climate has nature to cooperate with her toward these results. For while in a country that is blessed by nature everything tends to peace, in a disagreeable country everything tends to make men warlike and courageous, and so both kinds of country receive benefits from each other. For the latter helps with arms, the former with products of the soil, with arts and with character building. Think again of the simple determinism of Kaplan. And thus Europe developed because of a geography that was difficult in which to live. Kaplan and Strabo may be separated by 2 millennia, but that determinism remains constant. Anyway, Strabo looks to Lusitania, home to 30 different tribes, and describes it as blessed in fruits, in cattle, and in the abundance of its gold and silver and similar metals. But the region descended into brigandage and continuous warfare. Why is this? Strabo blames the mountaineers. It was the mountaineers who began this lawlessness, as was likely to be the case, for since they occupied sorry land and possessed but little property, they coveted what belonged to the others. Now you might think, so what? Strabo wrote that a long time ago and nobody's going to take such deterministic views on mountains and human behaviour as that today. Well, sadly they do. Umrani writes, the Pashtuns of the hills are a very particular sort. The geography of the area has made them what they are. The hill country is highly convoluted, barren, and isolated from the outside world. It is difficult for outsiders to get into the area. There is little settled agriculture, and it's hard to make a living. In the absence of hedge funds or the financial services industry, what can the tribesmen do but turn to crime, raiding the more prosperous settled territories, preying on the merchants passing along the ancient trade routes towards Central Asia or Persia? Think about that one for a moment. The argument here is this. The Pashtuns live in the lumpy areas of southern Afghanistan and northwest Pakistan. Because it's lumpy, financial services haven't set up their offices there. Because, therefore, the Pashtuns can't find local jobs in financial services, they have no option but to become criminals. As arguments go, it's about as strong as a paper bag, but this is the unspoken logic behind many assumptions about the relationship between regions such as Afghanistan, the people who live there, their nature, and their political systems. So this mountains or lumpy territory changes human behaviour thing has had quite a currency for quite a long time. Writing in 1583, Jean Baudin posits what we might today almost consider an experiment to see what this difference might be. He tells us to consider two theoretical places. They have identical latitude, longitude, identical climate. One of them is mountainous, the other is plain. Based on this, he expects there'll be a difference in human behaviour. Even in the same city, there's a difference in humour and in habits between those who live in the upper and those who live in the lower part of town. This is why cities are built in hilly countries. They're more subject to disorders and revolutions than those situated on level ground. Rome, built on 7 hills, was hardly ever free from civil commotions. One of the reasons I find Baudin so fascinating is that he almost used an experiment to explain a human behavioural difference. In the social sciences, that's hard to do, and it's especially hard when we study war. So hats off to him for trying. But as we'll see in the next session, by the 18th century, the experiments on mountains and war really had got a lot more crazy.